Good afternoon and welcome to our next session. I would now like to introduce to you Dr. Drew Ray. So welcome to the forum, Drew.
Good afternoon, Yvette. I'm coming to you from Mount Griffith in Brisbane, where it's a lovely sunny day.
Sounds wonderful. Well, Drew is a senior lecturer in the Safety Science Innovation Lab at Griffith University, and he also manages the lab's research program. His research uses a mix of ethnography, field experiments and theory building to investigate organisational safety practices. He's particularly interested in understanding the myths, rituals and bad habits that surround the work of managers and practitioners and how this influences frontline operation. Drew co-hosts the Safety of Work podcast and is an editorial board member for the journal Safety Science. In this session, Drew will explore the limits of knowledge when regulating safety and encourages attendees to consider how to operate effectively in those limits. Following the session, there will be time for questions. So if you do have a question for Drew, you can post it at any time throughout the session in the Q&A box on the right of your screen. So for now, I'll hand it over to you, Drew.
Thanks, Yvette. The dirty secret of process safety is that most of what we do isn't really about safety at all. It's about assurance. Now, we try to make ourselves feel better and look better by talking about safety and assurance as if they're basically the same thing, or maybe sometimes we talk about them as if they're two sides of the same coin. But that's just not true. Assurance and safety are fundamentally different goals that very often get confused. And I think that we can be more honest professionals and be better professionals and better regulators if we acknowledge the differences between safety and assurance, why they sometimes work together and why they sometimes work at odds with each other. The more that we just pretend that they're the same thing, the more we risk them separating and starting to conflict. So that's what I'd like to talk with you about for the next 20 minutes or so, is this difference and similarity between safety and assurance. So let's start off just by clarifying exactly what I mean when I use the two terms, safety and assurance. And I'm going to use a definition that's been around for a long time, which says that a thing is safe when the likelihood of harm coming from that thing is acceptable. And you can think of that definition almost like an equation. On the one hand, we have the likelihood of harm, and we make something safer when we change the amount of harm, the severity of potential accidents, and when we change the likelihood of those accidents. So anything that directly changes severity or directly changes likelihood, that's improving safety. But then the other side of the equation is the acceptability. Anything that we do to convince ourselves or to demonstrate to other people that the likelihood or severity of the harm is acceptable, that's assurance. So hopefully it should be fairly clear how the two things can be not the same, but also similar. Because if something is already safe, if it already has a very low likelihood of harm, then it's very easy to demonstrate that it's safe. It's very easy to provide assurance. And we would like to think that the opposite is not true, that as things become less safe, it becomes harder and harder to prove that they are safe, so that we're not providing assurance for unsafe systems. Or perhaps we think that in the process of trying to provide that assurance, we end up making systems safe. So let's go through a few sort of different scenarios where the two things aren't quite the same thing. The first one is what most safety practitioners would love to think, and particularly early on in their career, I think a lot of safety people think that there is their job. That the job of a safety person is to stop unsafe things. We go out into the world, we look for instances of unsafety, we bring those instances of unsafety to other people's attention. As a result of that, the unsafe things get fixed, no one gets hurt, we're the hero. Lovely story. happens incredibly rarely. If you think deeply about everything that you've done across your career, the actual number of times that an individual directly causes a change to the likelihood or severity of harm from a safety position rather than from an operational position, that is very rare. And a good example of this is if you think of audits. Audits are something that we love to study because they're nice and accessible safety artifacts. And in fact, I have a PhD student at the moment who's doing quite a large-scale project, just looking through what sort of recommendations come out of audits and whether those recommendations speak directly about safety or whether they speak about our assurance systems. And the answer is probably unsurprising, that the majority of audit findings fix up our assurance, but they don't directly fix up the likelihood or amount of harm that might be caused by a system. Or if they do so, it's only indirectly through several steps of documentation and processes. So the idea of it's unsafe, we make it safe, fairly unlikely. The second one that happens much, much more often is the thing is safe anyway, and so our assurance is showing other people that it's safe. And I would argue that this is 95% plus of all safety cases. We do the safety case starting off with the belief that we can demonstrate that this system is safe. We conduct a number of activities which perform that demonstration. And at the end, we've convinced people that the safe thing is safe. It's a valuable thing to do, but the process hasn't actually changed the likelihood of an accident happening. And so that's why instead of the hero, I've got here the picture of a fidget spinner. We can think of assuring things that are safe anyway as fidget spinner safety. The third case, and this is the one that we spend a lot of time worrying about, is the system is safe, but our safety practices raise doubts. And I don't think safety professionals like to admit just how much we worry about this. But the fact is that we all want to be seen as credible, realistic people. We want to be part of the team. We're very often being paid by a company who makes its profits out of operations. The last thing we want to do is to be the person who unrealistically claims that things are unsafe and stops something that is really quite reasonable from going ahead. And so a lot of our safety activities are carried out with that pragmatic state of mind, that really we believe that the thing is ultimately safe. There may be a little bit that needs to be done to improve it. Maybe we need to tidy up the documentation. Maybe we need to demonstrate a bit better that it's safe. But ultimately, we don't think it's unsafe, and we're not here to cause problems. We're just here to make things go smoothly. But then we need to worry about the final case, which is the nightmare of every safety professional's career. And this is the idea of creating false assurance. So this is the case where something is unsafe, but our safety activities say that in fact it is safe. And false assurance is something that you can find whenever you look at any major accident. You can always go back into the records of that accident and find that safety people existed. And those safety people were doing something. That something didn't prevent the accident. Therefore, it had to have been showing that the system was safe without actually making the system safe. And in hindsight, of course, this is really easy to spot, because in hindsight, we know that something has gone wrong. We know what the outcome was, and it's easy to point the fingers and say, you didn't do risk management properly. Sure, you did risk assessment, but this was a missed opportunity to find the accident. Sure, you had a safety program, but that safety program was raising multiple warnings that you weren't listening to. You failed to learn from all of these weak signals and small events. And as a result, you as a safety practitioner are somehow responsible for the accident that has happened. We do this to ourselves. We also do it to other people. We had a mention this morning of the Dreamworld accident. And I think later on in this workshop, we're having some people talk about Pike River. And I want people to think very carefully about what we're doing when we, in hindsight, try to say how process safety practices could have or should have stopped those events. Because that is very much a circular claim. It assumes that we know that process safety is effective in stopping accidents. And it might seem like we have good evidence of that. The good evidence of that might be the very low rate of accidents. We might say, look, most of the time, things go well. Most of the time we have minor incidents, but major accidents are very, very rare, and process safety activities are very, very common. Therefore, process safety is keeping us safe. If something goes wrong, it must be because they didn't do process safety. Or it must be because they did process safety, but didn't do it properly. Now, basically what I want to do here is cast doubt directly on that claim, is get you to start questioning whether process safety is responsible for safety, or whether process safety is just providing us assurance on top. Because here's the thing. If most systems, most of the time, are safe anyway, then of course, most of the time it doesn't matter whether our process safety activities work. If it's safe anyway, then it doesn't matter whether we're capable of detecting unsafety because the unsafety is not there. What matters isn't the many, many, many times when the system is safe anyway. What matters is whether we're able to detect in advance those rare occasions when things are dangerous. And I think that there's very good evidence that we can't. That even with the best processes available to us, we are not effective at spotting those cases. Now, let me throw a couple of examples at you. What you're looking at here is a picture of a space shuttle. Not just any space shuttle. This is a space shuttle after the most expensive system safety program in history. This is what happens to a space shuttle when the people doing safety literally are rocket scientists. And we look back and we say, gosh, they stuffed up. Their program didn't work. Their risk assessments were unrealistic. They made incorrect assumptions. They let themselves get trapped by confirmation bias. They let themselves get trapped by operational pressure. Now, all of that may or may not be true. But if they couldn't do it, if they were vulnerable to that, if with that amount of resource and that amount of expertise, that's what happened, maybe that's what's happening all the time. It's just that our systems are safer than the space shuttle was. Another example that might be a little bit closer to home is Deepwater Horizon. Now, I think most people here have some familiarity with the events, and I'm not going to go through them. I just want to talk about one particular part of this event. One of the things that went wrong, amongst many, on Deepwater Horizon was that the blowout preventer did not activate. There is a fault tree for blowout preventer activation. That fault tree is several hundred pages long. Nowhere in that fault tree are any of the 3 failures of the blowout preventer that happened on the day of the Deepwater Horizon accident. That's an example of large amounts of assurance that were incapable of finding the problem that caused the accident. And the only reason we know about it, and this is the scary bit, the only reason we know about it is because the accident happened. It wasn't spotted by the people who did the fault tree. It wasn't spotted by the people who signed off the fault tree. It wasn't spotted by the people who reviewed the fault tree. It wasn't responsible for the people who contractually accepted the fault tree. It wasn't spotted by the regulators who oversaw the production of the fault tree. We only found out that the fault tree didn't prevent the accident when the accident happened. Now, any of you who've got fault trees in front of you, you tell me how confident you are that they don't contain mistakes, that they don't contain the same sort of errors. And if you want to make that claim, I'm going to tell you that in a career of studying fault trees, I've never yet found one that didn't contain basic logic errors and basic omitted events. And that's true of many safety practices. We could be making mistakes constantly and we wouldn't know about it. So how do you know whether your assurance is lining up with your safety? What are the warning signs that they're drifting? What can we do to keep them together? First thing to note is that we can't just rely on the things that are safe. We need to look at the actual evidence. The evidence says that risk assessment techniques for rare events can't be validated. We have no scientific knowledge that says that any particular safety practice that deals with rare events is good at detecting those events. We do know that where we involve experts from regulators, experts from multiple countries, when they assess the same system, they do not come repeatedly to the same result. And if experts don't agree, then chances are that at least one of the experts is wrong. And we're not talking about minor disagreements here. We're talking about things like 5 to 6 orders of magnitude about disagreement about the likelihood of critical events. And we know that when we expect real-world risk assessments, real-world safety cases, that inevitably, when we put them to expert review, we find fundamental errors. So that might seem a little fatalistic. What can we do about it? The first thing we can do is look at timing. The important thing for timing of assurance versus safety is that the earlier we look at something, the more likely we are to be changing the actual safety rather than changing the assurance. Once the big decisions are already locked in, it's too late to change the safety. The most we can do is tinker around the edges, change the assurance. So we need to make sure that our safety activities are coming before the big decisions are made, not after those decisions. The second big change we can make is to look at the language. Pick up any major risk assessment or safety case and look at what it says as its top line claim. If it says that the purpose of the document is to demonstrate safety, if it says that the purpose of the document is to show safety, or to claim safety, or to measure safety, or to seek safety approval, that document has the language and psychology of assurance, not about safety. Documents that are genuinely about safety say the purpose of this document is to find how we can improve safety. Third thing to be wary of is standards. Any form of standardization fixes form, content, and process. It doesn't fix content. When you have fundamental weaknesses in methods and their application, it's very easy to overlook those if we spend too much time looking at form, content, and process. And so the use of standards tends to steer us away from looking at the technical details, which is where the accidents actually happen. And then the final thing to be wary of is what I think of as the technical death spiral. We try to overcome a lot of our fundamental uncertainty by dealing with obscure technical solutions. And what I'm talking about here are things like use of formalized notations, such as goal structure notation for safety cases, things like the use of complicated methods for soliciting and combining expert opinions about risk, things like AHP, even just basic things like the use of risk matrices and bow ties, which seem to be adding technical rigor, but what they're actually doing is adding a layer of obscurity on top of genuine conversations about risk. So, takeaway message: timing, language, standards, and technical assurance. Look out for those 4 things as hints that we're putting assurance in the place of safety. And then one final thing to take away is that in all of this conversation, I've been talking about assurance and safety as different things. Those are both valuable purposes. I personally think that actually the main function of safety people is not and shouldn't be about safety. Ultimately, what we want is for society to have cool stuff. We want operations to succeed. We want our companies to be profitable. And in order to do that, we have to reassure society that what we're doing is okay. And that is a valuable and important role to play. But you can't do that role. You can't be the advocate for your organization, the advocate for your systems, the demonstrator of safety, and also be the skeptic who is holding the line, being the safety hero at the same time. When we confuse those two roles, we get trapped into this situation where we're more likely to be creating false assurance than real safety. And so I think in order to fix that, we need to fundamentally change our language. We need to get away from saying, is this safe? Get away from that yes-no question where we're likely to get the answer wrong. The question is never, is this safe, or is this safe enough, or is this acceptable? Those questions, we might get the wrong answer. But what we can ask instead is, what else could we do? What should we be doing next in order to make this system more safe? And so long as that question is always at the back of our mind, there's no wrong answer to that question. It will always lead us towards taking action to improve safety rather than action to buffer up assurance, which is not the same thing as safety. I'm going to hand back to Yvette to lead question time. If anyone would like to discuss this further, I'll also be in the chat forums afterwards and very free to discuss with anyone who's interested.
Presentation, Drew. It's always good to look at different perspectives, and you certainly have given us something to consider, as well as challenge the way we all think about safety. So we'd love everyone to be part of the conversation via the Q&A box. I can see there are some questions already that have come through, so let's get started. Okay, we might start with the first one here. It's a comment and then a question, so just bear with me. A significant part of process safety is designing with inherent safety in mind. In other words, designing the right process and designing it right. It isn't just observation and response to incidents. That is about fourth agreeably important priority of PS. The high priority being design, construction and maintenance. So how can you say process safety is about assurance only?
Okay, no, that is an important question. And I think it is really interesting to look at two separate types of things. One of them is the genuine design for safety. So this is genuinely building in things to our system which would not otherwise be there. The other part of it is what we call design for safety, which is actually a set of assessment activities that we conduct early on in the life cycle. So these are things like hazard identification, risk assessment. Now, it's an empirical question whether the design improvements would happen with or without the conduct of those parallel safety activities. And I think there is a lot of evidence to suggest that, in fact, the safety activities are not what drive the design improvement. What drives the design improvement are good engineers consulting with good operational staff to understand physically what makes a system safe. And very often those safety activities are really only documenting and recording decisions that would have happened anyway. There are a couple of clues to this. One of them is to look at the exact timing of the activities, when the safety activity gets done versus when the design activity gets done. The second clue is to look at a thing that looks like time travel. So that is, in these safety activities, how much is it talking about things that are going to happen now, and how much is it talking about decisions that have already been made, or decisions that are being made significantly downstream? And if you look closely, you find that actually the majority of findings from so-called design safety activities are talking about the past or the future, not about the design decisions that are currently being made.
Okay, thank you for your response. On to the next question. So if the question is what we should do next, how do you have assurance that what you have done is enough for now?
I think it's the wrong question. I think it's a very dangerous question. I think the key thing that safety practitioners can do, and I'm talking here about people who actually have safety job titles. This becomes harder for people in operational roles with safety responsibilities. But the thing that people with safety in their job titles can do is they can be the ones who are always asking the what next question and never asking the good enough question. And this goes right up to the board. It is not actually as useful as people think to tell the board we're doing enough about safety. That's what the board would like to hear, but it's not what they need to hear. What the most useful thing to do is to say what's next and to get people thinking about what else we could do. Now, they might decide to do it. They might decide not to do it. That is a decision that needs to be made, but that's the decision you want to be focusing on. Worrying about whether what you've got is enough just leads you into incorrect answers.
Okay, I've got another one here for you. In your view, when are regulators most effective?
That is a tricky question. I'm going to give two answers to these. The first one is that regulators are effective when things have already gone wrong. That is an important and necessary role, that we do sometimes need to make that decision about whether enough was done for safety. And the time to make that decision is when things have gone wrong. That's the time when we can look back and say, look, this was clearly unacceptable. We need to change the rules. We need to change the requirements. There need to be consequences that things didn't happen as they were supposed to. The second thing that regulators can do is they can incentivize constructive activity. And this is where regulators can, but often aren't as effective as they should be, because very often we accidentally incentivize assurance. We incentivize people to divert resources and time to showing us that things are safe, when we should be incentivizing them to spend time on what's most important. Sometimes the most useful thing a regulatory member of staff can do is when someone tries to show them a document, to say, I'm not interested. I don't care what the document said. Take me to the physical equipment, show me the physical equipment. Take me to talk to an operator, let me talk to them. And by showing that we're interested in the real physical safety and not interested in the documents, that can send some very powerful signals.
Okay, thank you. Now, another question that's just popped up. If, as you note, that the risk assessment experts cannot consistently come up with the same questions to risk assessment questions, how do we deal with regulation which is stated absolutely the PCBU must determine all the major incidents which can occur?
There are two separate questions here. One of them is identification of dangerous scenarios. I have no question that that is a useful activity. By thinking about dangerous scenarios, that helps us create designs which are likely to minimize the likelihood of those scenarios. The second step, though, in risk assessment is working out what is the likelihood of that dangerous scenario. And frankly, I don't care, and I don't think we can do that. It doesn't matter whether we think the odds are 1 in a million or 1 in 100,000 or somewhere in between. Once we've identified a dangerous scenario, we should do what we practicably can do to address that scenario. And it's the step of quantifying it, of trying to assess and measure that scenario, that I don't think actually helps us come up with good, reasonable solutions.
Okay, we still have time for a few more questions. The next one we've got here. How do risk matrices add obscurity? I thought that they add clarification to the understood hypothetical incident.
That is a common perception. But what I would like the person who asked the question to consider is, given that you already know that the hazard exists, you already know that there is a potential problem and that this is something that we want to control. By putting it into a matrix, what further information have you created? Because there are really only one decision you need to make. Are we going to do something more about this, or aren't we? And unless the risk matrix helps you make that decision, and helps you make that decision in a better way than you would otherwise, it has simply added obscurity. We know what the problem is. What are we going to do about it? And if the risk matrix hasn't helped you with that decision, then it hasn't added clarity. It's just obscured.
Okay, and just another one for you. How can the unrealistic assurance be picked up?
There are a few things that I've mentioned in this talk that I genuinely think are part of it. I think we can tell from the language. I think that often when you read closely a safety case, you can see where people are trying to convince you rather than simply putting facts in front of you. And that sense that someone is trying to convince you, I think, is a serious difficulty. The other thing that we can do is we can step aside from the assurance activity and ask questions ourselves back that are not based on what's in front of us, but are based on our simple understanding. You forget about the document. Tell me, what are you most worried about? And what are you doing to improve what you're most worried about? And if someone can answer that with a frank conversation, then I think that is probably both better assurance and better safety than looking at a table of risks classified according to a matrix, quantified according to fault tree analysis, represented as a GSN argument.
Okay, thank you. Next one, do you propose an alternative method to prioritise safety improvement activities if efforts to quantify risks are ineffective?
I do not believe that prioritisation is nearly as important as we think it is. I think prioritisation is something that we have retrofitted to explain why we assess risk. It's not the reason why we assess risk in the first place. There is nothing in regulation, there is nothing in common sense that says that when you have 5 hazards, you pick 2 of those hazards and you protect against those, and you don't protect against the other 3. The only type of prioritization that should matter is proportionately selecting mitigations to match the extent of the hazard, not to actually prioritize. There's a much longer conversation to be had here, but I don't really have time to go into that. I just want to think about that. Do you really need to prioritize as much as you think you did? Have a think about that, and I'd be very happy to discuss further.
Okay, we've got time for at least one more question. Okay, the next one. We spend a lot of time conducting risk assessments that are ineffective. What can we do instead to assess whether a system is safe if the barriers are in a degraded state?
Let me give you 2 answers to that question. The first one is, just because risk assessments don't work doesn't mean that we need to do something instead. If we're doing the risk assessment ultimately to make us happy, to make us feel assured, to convince us that things are safe, and they are not fit for purpose, we don't need to replace them. It's okay to just get rid of them altogether and to spend our time on other things rather than trying to fill that gap. There are so many useful things you can do with your resources other than try to assess risk by whatever method is available. But the second part of that question is, if you're talking about a system with degraded defenses, why the heck are you wasting resources on risk assessment? Why are you not devoting every resource you have to doing something about those degraded defenses? It once made sense to you to have those defenses in place. If those defenses are not now in place, then wasting resource trying to justify why it's okay not to have a defense that previously you thought you need to have, that seems to me like a very skewed priority for a safety professional.
Great, and we've got time. This is our last question now. What are some of the key factors that leads to safety cases becoming decoupled from operational safety?
The amount of time and effort that we spend on the safety case. The more complicated we make the safety case, the larger it is. The more it is necessary to have dedicated personnel spending their time on that safety case. The extreme example of this happens outside of major hazards. It tends to happen in things like aerospace, where we have career professionals whose sole job is to do fault trees, because that amount of work has just grown to the point where we need specialists. The more and more we need to divert dedicated resource to these things, specialists who understand the notations, who understand the safety case, who understand how to manage the regulator, that guarantees that we have different people doing the operations and preparing the safety case. As soon as we've got to that point where we have different specialists, one managing safety of operations, one preparing the safety case, we've guaranteed decoupling. The simpler we make the safety case, the more direct, the more linked it is into operations to start with, the less decoupled it's going to become.
Well, thank you. Well, we'll leave it there. So thank you so much for your time today, Drew.
Thanks, Yvette.